Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Seward. I'm the Water Program Advisor with Water Resources Branch in the Government of Yukon. And today I will be giving an overview of the Yukon Guide for Developing Water Quality Objectives and Effluent Quality Standards. Along with me, Amelie Janin, who is the Senior Scientist for Water Quality, will present, as well as Bill Slater of Slater Environmental. So this presentation will give a technical overview of these guidelines and what they entail, the implementation plan for them, and how they have come to be developed. So let's begin. So we're doing things a bit different given COVID. We're experimenting with making a video. So this video is going to describe the value and components of these guidelines and hopefully answer some preliminary questions you may be having about these guidelines. The guide is out for public review and we want to know what you think. So to date, we have sent out the guidelines with no set timeline just due to COVID. We wanted to do a soft launch to make sure that everyone had time to reference these guidelines if they did have the capacity. And if not, that's okay. So this video sort of marks the initiation of a more formal engagement period. So we will be opening a timeline of 60 days from the date of sending this video to provide your feedback. So as I said, I will be doing this presentation with Bill Slater of Slater Environmental, as well as Amelie Janin, who's the Senior Scientist of Water Resources Branch. Throughout these slides, I will go through why this guide is important, the origins of the guide, how the Mine License Improvement Initiative fits into all this, the audience of the guide, how the guide will help with water management, and what the engagement process has involved. Hi, Emily. So I just wanted to hear from you why these guidelines are important to you.
Oh, yeah. So those guidelines are very important to me and to the government of Yukon, actually. And we actually crafted this guide because we want to help the quartz mining industry in Yukon to effectively develop effluent quality standards and water quality objectives. Those are things that we use a lot, and we want to make sure that we have good conversation about it and we have good numbers and good standards in the end. Maybe another, I was also happy to be involved in this work because we did receive very valuable input from all members of the working group, and it's been a pleasure to work with everybody and have everybody's input reflected into this guide. Can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Andrea Kemmert. I'm a mining technologist in the Mineral Resources Branch within the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources of Yukon Government.
Thank you. And so, Andrea, you've been involved as a working group member for the prediction and the development of the Water Quality Objective and Effluent Quality Standard Guide. Could you tell us, in your opinion, why is this guide important?
The guide will provide a structured approach for developing water quality objectives and effluent quality standards, and this will provide clarity and predictability in mining processes. By using the guide, mine proponents and their consultants will know what methods and what requirements are needed.
Good, yeah. Thank you. Can you tell us why you did tackle this work?
Thanks, Emily. I guess that's a bit of a difficult question to answer in a way, but the reality is I was happy to be involved in the development of guidance with respect to water quality objectives. I've worked in the water management field in Yukon for more than 25 years, and of course, having better guidance on water quality objective development is always useful, and I think it leads us to better water management decisions in the territory as a result.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Emma. So, question for you. How did the Yukon government engage with First Nations so far as the development of this guide?
Thanks, Emily. That's a good question. So there's been ongoing discussions with the Mining Memorandum of Understanding Working Group and with the Council of Yukon First Nations on how this guide has been updated. Based upon the input to date, they support re-engaging on the draft guide to ensure that it includes the values and perspectives of Yukon First Nations. So the origin of these guidelines. So they were initiated through the Mine License Improvement Initiative in 2014. So this process was started in 2014, whereas the guide, this specific guide, was initiated in 2015 by a bunch of different bodies. So there's a YG, Government of Yukon Technical Working Group, involved in this process, as well as the Yukon Water Board Secretariat, YESAB, and the First Nations Mining Caucus. So some key definitions to start. What are effluent quality standards? So these EQSs, as we call them, are defined as the maximum allowable concentration of a contaminant of potential concern that can be released into the environment as effluent. These are the standards usually defined in a water use license. So the water quality objectives, which we call WQOs, are defined as acceptable water quality conditions in the receiving environment that may be affected by a project based on the sensitivity of aquatic ecosystems to contaminants of potential concern. So how is engagement taking place? As I said, earlier this year, we released all the materials related to these guidelines to a variety of stakeholder and First Nations governments. And from there, we just left the timelines open. So now we are tightening the timelines a bit. So we're hoping to do a 60-day engagement period. And any feedback can be sent to this contact here, which is Emily Jenin. So moving forward, we're going to hear from Bill Slater of Slater Environmental, and then followed by Emily Jenin, who works for Water Resources Branch. So now Bill will give an overview of the framework and methods within the guide. So take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, I'm Bill Slater with Slater Environmental Consulting. I've been the primary author of the guide since it was completed. At least the initial complete draft was done by McDonald Environmental Sciences in late 2016. The guide has been through several versions since then, including, as Emma noted, a major revision based on input received during a public engagement process in 2017. As Emma said, I'm going to provide a summary of the framework and methods that are described in the guide for development of water quality objectives and effluent quality standards. First of all, the objective set out in 2015-2016 was to provide more clarity and certainty about processes for establishing water quality objectives and effluent quality standards for hard rock mining projects in Yukon. This was to be done by providing clear guidance about how to develop water quality objectives and how to use those to derive effluent quality standards. At this point, it's worth highlighting the difference between water quality objectives and effluent quality standards. Water quality objectives define water quality conditions in receiving waters, for example, in streams or lakes. They tell us what water quality is acceptable in these conditions, while effluent quality standards define water quality conditions that are acceptable at the discharge from a mining project or facility, at what we call the end of pipe. The relationship between water quality objectives and effluent quality standards is really about dilution. And we'll get to that in more detail when we talk about deriving effluent quality standards. Based on the overarching objectives set out when we began developing the guide, it came up, I guess to state its sort of overall objective is that it supports the government's need to balance multiple priorities while providing enhanced certainty for regulated quartz mining projects. The guide includes some overarching guiding principles that are intended to support the kind of overall interpretation of the guide and its use. The principles were included following the 2017 engagement because we heard people's view that we needed to define some overarching principles. Some of those key principles are listed on the slide, and I'll just highlight a few of them. The first one arose from discussions with First Nations and is also consistent with the Yukon Water Strategy. It establishes maintenance of natural conditions in water bodies as a preferred water management goal, while recognizing that there may be reasons for using water in ways that may affect this goal. The second principle establishes the understanding that the driver for establishing water quality objectives is the aquatic ecosystem. The ability or not of a project to meet certain water quality conditions is not the driver. The third principle listed on the slide requires consideration of the rights and interests of First Nations, for example, rights defined in treaties or through court decisions when making water management decisions. And the fourth one, which is the last one I'll highlight here, requires application of reasonable and practical measures to reduce pollution rather than pursuing less stringent water quality objectives. So the guide describes a systematic process for developing and implementing water quality objectives and deriving effluent quality standards. The broad steps listed on this slide are to determine a water management approach, to identify the contaminants of concern, to select water quality objective procedures and use them to develop the water quality objectives, to measure attainment of the objectives and validate whether the objectives are effective, and finally to derive effluent quality standards. And of course, those don't necessarily proceed in exact sequence necessarily in all cases. I'll talk more about most of the steps in the remainder of the presentation. As I mentioned in the last slide, the first step involves selecting a water management approach because the decision about water management approach influences the subsequent steps in the process. The guide identifies 3 water management approaches that reflect different water management goals and therefore lead to different narrative water quality objectives. We have in the guide the non-degradation approach, where the aim is to maintain baseline water quality. We have the use protection approach, where the aim is to protect the most sensitive designated water use. Designated water uses are the specific uses that may occur in a water body, for example, use by aquatic life or for drinking water. And objectives in Canada have often been set using a use protection approach. The third and final approach is the use restoration approach that applies to areas where water quality is already affecting the designated uses and where the aim is to avoid any further degradation of baseline water quality conditions and, where possible, to support restoration of designated uses. The guide does provide flexibility with respect to decisions about water management approaches. There could be different approaches selected for different mine phases or for different locations that may be affected by a mine. This slide is actually a figure from the guide, and it illustrates the decision-making for water management approaches consistent with the guiding principles that I described earlier. There are some definitive criteria for water management approaches. For example, waters that are drinking water supplies or are located in national or territorial parks have to be managed using the non-degradation approach. The guide also describes more subjective scientific, social, and cultural factors that can influence decision-making about water management approaches. For example, importance to First Nations or local residents. Identifying and considering these factors requires effective engagement with relevant governments, communities, groups, and individuals. And so we see engagement in this particular case as a fairly important component of implementing the guide.
Bill, I'll just jump in with a question. So many people are concerned that using a non-degradation approach would mean that there should not be development upstream. Can you please clarify that?
Thanks, that's a helpful question. The application of the non-degradation approach is intended to recognize the guiding principle that waters of the Yukon are managed to maintain natural water quality and quantity unless a compelling, sustainable, and wise use of water by people warrants application of an alternative water management goal. And that's quoted directly from the guide as one of the principles. But the non-degradation approach is not a prohibition on development, and it's not intended to be that. Instead, it aims to create an effective balance that responsible development projects proceed, and at the same time, they consider, recognize, and respect the social, economic, and environmental value of Yukon waters. There are two, I think, critical ways in which the guide provides for projects to work with the non-degradation approach rather than be stopped by it. First, the guide provides flexibility about application of the non-degradation approach with respect to parameters, locations, and timing. The Minto mine, for example, has non-degradation water quality objectives for post-closure, but use protection water quality objectives during operation. This allows them the flexibility they need during operations while recognizing the need to remediate conditions as part of closure. Also, Newmont has proposed non-degradation objectives for locations that are further downstream with greater dilution ratios. The second important consideration for the non-degradation approach relates to the definitions of attainment as described in Chapter 5 of the guide. The measures of attainment recognize that the baseline variability of water quality and define thresholds that allow water quality conditions that fall within the baseline. Attainment is considered and measured using data sets, not individual data points. This includes whether the average conditions fall within the upper range of baseline average conditions and whether the upper range conditions after a project fall within the upper range of baseline. So there's those two critical ways in which there's a flexibility to allow the non-degradation approach to function with development projects. The guide goes on to describe specific methods for identifying contaminants of concern. When you're developing water quality objectives, these methods rely on comparison of predicted water quality in receiving waters with baseline water quality and with water quality guidelines. The specific comparisons required depend on the water management approach. Water quality guidelines are the benchmarks that are established by government agencies, for example, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, better known as the CCME. Generally, the guide provides for removal of substances from the list of contaminants of concern if there's no water quality guideline available for that particular substance. As I mentioned, the comparisons you have to do depend on which water management approach you're following. The non-degradation approach only requires comparison of predicted water quality with baseline water quality. Contaminants of potential concern are those where more than 5% of receiving water conditions are predicted to exceed the 95th percentile of baseline conditions, or where annual means of receiving water are predicted to exceed the annual mean of baseline conditions. Any predicted source concentration that is more than 2 times the 95th percentile of baseline would also trigger identification of a contaminant of concern. Source concentrations are the concentrations at actual mine sources rather than in the receiving environment. The use protection and use restoration approaches require comparison with both baseline water quality and water quality guidelines. The guide defines thresholds for identifying contaminants of potential concern based on both types of comparisons. As I just described, identifying contaminants of potential concern requires a strong understanding of baseline or background water quality conditions. A similar understanding is required for implementing some of the methods for developing water quality objectives, for example, something called the background concentration procedure. To support the development of effective and defensible water quality objectives, the guide establishes specific data requirements for characterizing baseline or background water quality, and this was one of the topics that led to a lot of input during the 2017 engagement on the guide. Specifically, the guide requires 3 consecutive years of recent water quality data collected on a monthly basis. It also requires data from 1 or more annual intensive sampling events in each of those 3 years, where you're collecting at least 5 samples in 30 days during periods of high short-term water quality variability, likely during freshet in Yukon. The requirement for 3 years of data is based on statistical analysis of Yukon natural background data sets, which I'll describe in the next couple of slides.
I'll just jump in with another quick question, Bill. So the guide makes a distinction between a background water quality and baseline water quality. Can you please speak to the importance of this distinction?
Yeah, thank you, I can. The definitions in the guide make a distinction between background water quality and baseline water quality, and it can be important to distinguish between the two. If we think about a stream where we want to establish water quality objectives today, for example, baseline water quality refers to the current conditions in the stream. Background water quality, on the other hand, refers to conditions in the stream before the onset of any local human activities. Background and baseline water quality can be the same thing in many streams where human activities have not adversely affected water quality. Of course, the distinction can be important at several stages in the water quality objective development process. For example, selecting a water management approach relies on an understanding of whether the baseline conditions already exceed background conditions. Identifying contaminants of concern relies on comparison with both baseline and background conditions in some cases. Applying the background concentration procedure relies on either background conditions or baseline conditions, depending on the water management approach selected. So the guide tries to provide some clarity about how to consider both background and baseline conditions as needed.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we take the example of Keno, there has been mining activities there for about 100 years. Can we measure the baseline conditions in the affected streams by taking samples today for the next 3 years? Because there's effects of historical mining. But we can't define the background water quality because there wasn't samples taken 100 years ago or so. Is that correct, or could you explain that a bit further?
Yeah, and in concept, I think it's generally correct. We can measure the baseline in the stream right now. We can't go out there today and measure the baseline in that specific stream. We can't go out and measure the background in that specific stream at that location. But the guide in Appendix 6 describes 2 additional methods for characterizing background water quality. The first is reliance on data collected from unaffected areas of the stream, for example, upstream areas. And the second is reliance on data collected from an appropriate reference location that may be another stream nearby. Both of those methods could be considered for defining background water quality for areas like streams affected by Keno Hill mines, where we can't measure it directly. So as I said a few minutes ago, the decision to require 3 years of baseline or background water quality data was based on statistical analysis of data sets from natural Yukon streams. This is where things get a little bit complicated on the statistical front. The figure on this slide illustrates the findings from that statistical analysis, though it's a generalization of findings, not actual data. That's coming on the next slide. Water quality in receiving waters is inherently variable, but the development of appropriate water quality objectives requires good understanding of both the central tendency conditions, for example, the median, and extremes, for example, the 90th or 95th percentiles of the data sets. So we need to understand the variability in the data. As shown on the graph, the statistical analysis considered the standard deviation of measured contaminant concentrations plotted on the vertical axis of the figure versus the number of years of data plotted on the horizontal axis. This allows us to evaluate how our understanding of the variability improves as we get longer data sets. The statistical analysis using data from 12 different streams indicated that 3 years of data provides a good balance between the benefits of larger data sets and the costs associated with data collection. The variability is high with only a single year of data, and the medians are often underestimated because the data sets don't contain interannual variability. Our understanding about the extreme values converges quickly for the first 3 years. While it continues to converge after that, the rate of convergence tends to be much slower. One thing to remember is that the statistical trends in baseline or background water quality can only be detected with 3 years or more of data. So we can't actually see whether the data is changing under natural or baseline conditions unless we have at least 3 years of data. So now we can look quickly at a somewhat more complicated figure that illustrates some actual analysis for dissolved metals in Bunker Creek. Copper's on the left figure, iron in the middle, and lead in the right. In this case, the lead results are difficult to interpret because much of the data were at concentrations below the detection limit for the lab. For the other two, the black lines show the analysis for the whole year, red for the open water, and blue for the under ice season. Solid lines represent the median of the standard deviations, which is the measure of variability of the data, while the dotted lines represent the 90th and 10th percentiles of the standard deviations. The number of years of data is displayed on the horizontal axis, and you can see that the results for copper and iron, especially for the whole year and the open water analyses, show similar patterns to what we illustrated in the simulated figure on the previous slide. Understanding of variability converges rapidly in the first 3 years. We did a second type of statistical analysis specifically to consider our understanding of the extreme water quality conditions by looking at the 95th percentile of data for data sets of various durations. Understanding these extreme values is important for developing water quality objectives because we often use that statistic in, for example, in background concentration procedure analysis or in looking at selection of contaminants of potential concern. So this figure shows the calculated 95th percentile of copper concentrations on the vertical axis as compared to the years of data used in the calculation. So we're calculating the 95th percentile from 1 year of data or from 2 years of data or 3 years of data. This is again for Bunker Creek. When we calculate the 95th percentile using only a single year of data, we see a very large range of actual values. For comparison, the dotted line represents the 95th percentile calculated using the whole data set, which is the best representation of the 95th percentile. As we increase the number of years used to calculate the 95th percentile, which of course includes more and more data, we have significant convergence in our ability to predict a representative 95th percentile. Nonetheless, on balance, we still have a tendency, whether with a single year of data or with 5 years of data, we still have a tendency to underestimate the 95th percentile. On the figure, we see most of the calculated 95th percentiles falling below the value calculated for the whole data set. The tendency to underestimate is, of course, more pronounced with less years of data. For mining projects, water quality objectives developed using underestimates of extreme values can be problematic because natural conditions may lead to exceedance of such values more often than expected. Longer data sets reduce the risk of these types of underestimates and associated water quality objectives that do not accurately reflect natural variability in the water course. So these statistical analyses that we did led us to the conclusion that 3 years was a reasonable balance of requirements for baseline or background data collection. So we're finally at the stage of talking about methods for developing water quality objectives. The guide identifies 5 methods. The first, and likely the most common, is to adopt generic water quality objectives. Adopt generic water quality guidelines. The other 4 are methods for developing site-specific water quality objectives, which are generally consistent with methods described by the CCME. The guide includes references to appropriate CCME documentation, but also includes appendices that describe specific requirements for applying methods in Yukon. I'll provide a bit more detail about some of the methods later in the presentation. So how do you select which method to use? Table 2 in the guide, which is summarized on this slide, provides information about selection of methods. First, the water management approach can dictate which method. Only the background concentration procedure, using baseline data, can be used when applying the non-degradation approach, because the approach relies on comparison with baseline conditions. Any of the 5 methods can be used when applying the use protection or use restoration approaches. In most cases, use restoration would begin by using the background concentration procedure, again using baseline data, and progress to other methods as conditions improve. Decisions about the method will depend on the water quality and aquatic ecosystem conditions at the site.
So, Bill, how much flexibility is built into the guide currently to develop these water quality objectives?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we did try to build in flexibility. There are multiple levels of flexibility, I think, in the guide. First, the guide is somewhat inherently flexible in that it describes 5 different methods for defining water quality objectives, so you have the option to select whichever one works most effectively for a parameter or location. Second, there's flexibility provided within some of the methods. For example, when using the method that accounts for bioavailability and toxicity modifying factors, the guide provides for the use of biotic ligand models. These models quantify the relationship between toxicity of specific contaminants and various bioavailability and toxicity modifying factors. Finally, there are several areas in which the guide provides additional flexibility to rely on information, analysis, or methods that aren't specifically described in the guide. In these cases, there is guidance about what proponents need to do to demonstrate suitability of a proposed approach. For example, the guide provides some guidance about what is required to demonstrate suitability of alternative water quality guidelines that are not on the primary or secondary list included in the guide. So that outlines some of the areas where there's flexibility. So to come back to the methodology around adopting water quality guidelines, the guide and Appendix 1 provide details about the identification and selection of water quality guidelines that can be applied in Yukon. It specifically identifies a hierarchy of guideline sources, but it also provides flexibility, as we just discussed, to consider other guidelines that may be more relevant or up to date. Guidelines developed by the CCME and Health Canada are the primary source, and those developed by the BC Ministry of Environment are a secondary source, if substances are not in the primary guidelines or if BC has a more up-to-date guideline. So as I said, the guide provides for use of other guidelines, and it describes the requirements to support proposals for use of guidelines from other sources. For example, guidelines must be developed using methods that are consistent with the CCME methods and have a compatible protection goal. They have to be relevant for local conditions, and where possible, they should consider more up-to-date or relevant test data and consider relevant bioavailability and toxicity modifying factors.
Bill, to jump in again, I just wanted to talk about a very specific example. So let's say I have a mine where arsenic is a contaminant of concern. The CCME guideline for arsenic is 5 UG liters, but it has been developed over 20 years ago. A secondary source, the BCMOE, also says that this amount it also says this amount. So, however, how do I have a newer guideline from a different source that could be used because it has been developed using more up-to-date methodology? If there is a newer guideline, should I be using that instead, given the dated nature of these 2 other guidelines?
Yeah, so there could be circumstances in which you could use a newer guideline from another source. Excuse me. if it's developed with a newer methodology. Appendix 1 of the guide provides some information about what considerations when proposing guidelines that are not from the primary and secondary sources. Guidelines developed, for example, with more up-to-date methodology is one of the reasons listed for proposing alternative guidelines. So that would be a reason in this case. You would still have to demonstrate that the alternative guideline achieves a protection goal similar to that of the CCME goal. And so, for example, just to quote the CCME goal, what it states is protection and maintenance of all forms of aquatic life and all aquatic stages in the aquatic environment for indefinite exposure periods. So you would have to demonstrate that you're looking at a similar protection goal for a guideline you're bringing forward. Appendix 1 also provides some information about what information you have to provide to support a proposal for an alternative guideline. For example, detailed descriptions of the methods that were used, toxicity testing, endpoints, thresholds, the data reliability and quality, and consideration of bioavailability and toxicity modifying factors. So all those things are things you would have to provide if you wanted to put forward a different guideline.
Great, thank you.
So before I talk about any of the other methods, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the topic of what we've titled here, total versus dissolved contaminants. So the guide encourages proponents to develop water quality objectives for forms of contaminants that are most relevant to their projects. In many cases, this means that mining projects should consider water quality objectives for dissolved contaminants rather than total concentrations, because the contaminant risks from mines are often associated with dissolved forms. Nonetheless, of course, total forms of contaminants may still be relevant depending on what sources are present at a mine, and also on whether contaminants may change form when they enter the receiving environment. For example, iron in some cases. The guide provides flexibility so that water quality objectives can be in place for the most relevant forms of contaminants. So again, this is an area where there's flexibility to establish water quality objectives that are most relevant for a particular site. So to come back to methods, I'll talk a little bit about the method that we've titled Accounting for Bioavailability and Toxicity Modifying Factors, which I've mentioned a few times. We call them BTMFs. So these methods consider water quality characteristics, for example, pH, hardness, or dissolved organic carbon, that may influence bioavailability or toxicity of specific substances. Many guidelines already consider BTMFs, for example, hardness, pH, and organic carbon for the CCME zinc guideline. The guide, like the CCME, describes the relatively simple water effect ratio procedure for developing water quality objectives. However, the guide also acknowledges that this procedure has limitations, for example, relying on testing for acute toxicity to develop effect ratios. As a result, the guide also provides for use of other methods for considering BTMFs, including the use of biotic ligand models that are based on biochemical behavior of contaminants. The guidance for use of these kinds of models is consistent with methods that have been applied by Environment and Climate Change Canada, though we don't have specific methodology yet defined by the CCME. So we finally get to the last step in the process described in the guide, the derivation of effluent quality standards. And effluent quality standards are to be back calculated based on the water quality objectives and the available dilution in the water body. Calculation of effluent quality standards must also consider the assimilative capacity in the stream. And there are equations provided in the guide for making these calculations. The assimilative capacity, and I'll talk about it a bit more in another slide, is the difference between background water quality and the use protection water quality objective. Assimilative capacity is, of course, considered a resource. And finally, with respect to effluent quality standards, they also have to consider, or can also consider, mixing zones, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. So to come back to assimilative capacity, the guide speaks about allocation of assimilative capacity and whether a particular project can use all of the assimilative capacity or what portion of the assimilative capacity can be used by a particular project. And decisions about allocation of assimilative capacity are influenced by scientific, social, and cultural factors. For example, what are other existing uses for the water or plans for future uses? What are cumulative effects? How do you consider loss of future opportunities? What about treaty and Aboriginal rights with respect to water? And what about bioaccumulation and biomagnification of contaminants in the water body and sediments? So identifying and considering these factors, of course, requires effective engagement with relevant governments, communities, groups, and individuals. And this is another area where development of water quality objectives will require engagement with other parties. The allocation of assimilative capacity only really applies for a use protection approach. For non-degradation, the aim is to maintain existing conditions and not allocate loading capacity within the use protection envelope. For use restoration, of course, the assimilative capacity has already been consumed just by definition of the conditions in which you would use that approach. Finally, I'll talk a little bit, if I can get the right slide, I'll talk a little bit about mixing zones. They provide an area for effluent to mix with a water body and are an important consideration for discharge of effluent into receiving waters. Within a mixing zone, contaminant concentrations would likely exceed the water quality objectives. The guide provides flexibility about the size and shape of mixing zones, but describes principles that must be considered when establishing mixing zones. For example, effluent can't be acutely toxic and cannot impair designated uses. There must be areas for safe passage of aquatic life. For example, we may not want a mixing zone to cover the full width of a stream so that fish can swim past. So now that we've talked about deriving effluent quality standards, that wraps up my presentation about the guide. And thank you for listening.
Hi again, everyone. Thanks to Bill for the overview of the technical aspects of the guidelines. Now, Emily Jenin, who's the Senior Scientist Water Quality for the Water Resources Branch, will give an overview of the implementation of the guide. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Emma. Hi, everybody. I'm actually very happy to be talking about the implementation because it's been years in the making. We've been working on this guide for a long time now, and talking about the implementation of it is great. So we are nearing, we are getting toward the finish line here and having this guide published and used. So this is great. So thank you, Emma. So as you said in the introduction, so I'm the Senior Scientist Water Quality for Yukon government for the Department of Environment. And I've been involved with this guide for, I think, close to a couple of years. And I've been leading the working group, which includes Bill and other people from different departments, including people from, and also people from YESAB and from the Yukon Water Board Secretariat as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how things are going to roll out. But first, I want to talk about where we are at right now. So as Bill said, the guide was initially started in 2015. There has been major public review and feedbacks in 2017, and we are now presenting to you a new revised guide that include everything that we've heard in the the new study on statistics and everything as Bill presented. And really now it's really about what you think about the guide. We want to hear from you how this guide is going to work for you and what you think of it. And we so we are very open to feedback, and we are seeking feedback from everyone and every First Nation government and every stakeholders. And then, as Emma said, we are hoping to hear from you, and then we will integrate those feedbacks and those comments, and we hope to maybe have a final version of the guide on late. So the first thing that I want to start with is that this is a Yukon government guide. So Yukon government has the primary responsibility for this guide. And we did this guide because we want to clearly lay out the expectations. And basically, we are expecting the proponents to follow the guidance that are in this guide and to follow the methods and the approach that are described here. When Yukon government reviews projects that are either project proposals or license application, we will be looking at the project and we will compare with the guide. So is the recommendation in the guide being followed by the proponent in the application? So as I said earlier, we have had a working group where YESAB and Yukon Water Board Secretariat staff have participated, and this working group was involved all along the development of the guide. So Bill was the lead author, and the working group provided feedback during this time. And recently, Yukon government sought endorsement of the guide by both YESAB and by the Yukon Water Board, and we are also hoping that assessor and licensing officers are going to use the guide when they review individual projects or individual license applications.
Emily, quick question. So to clarify, how are YESAB and the Yukon Water Board going to be involved with the guide? Are they going to help with implementation of it? Are they going to endorse the guide and ask proponents to follow it? Sort of what relationship do these bodies have to the guide?
Yeah, great question, Emma. So far we had one person from each board or board secretariat who participated in the development of the guide over the last since 2015. So they have been heavily involved in the development of the guide. And moving forward, when the guide will be published, we seek the endorsement, meaning that we ask that the board are fully, almost like have their logo on the guide. And we've heard back from YESAB that this is not possible for legal reasons. The first reason is that YESAB was established as an independent body, and for that reason, they cannot sign a document with Yukon government and YESAB. It goes against the main purpose of the establishment of YESAB. And the other reason is that because the guide covers water quality objective and also effluent quality standards, YESAB does not define the standards. It's outside of the scope of their assessment, and so they cannot fully endorse the guide for that reason. However, what they've told us is that they acknowledge that the methods that are presented in the guide are widely acceptable, and they see water quality objective being used as de facto thresholds to determine the significance of an impact to water and to the aquatic resources. When it comes to the Yukon Water Board is fully aware of us developing this guide. Again, they have had one member of their staff participating in the development, and they will tell us after this engagement period how they are going to endorse the guide and how they are going to use. So I cannot answer that question yet, but for sure we are hoping and expecting, and we have all indication that the Yukon Water Board is going to use this guide in one way or another.
Great, thanks, Emily. I guess this question can't likely be answered just yet, but should we expect that YESAB and the Yukon Water Board will be using the guide once it's published, even if they don't endorse it or just based on their feedback on it? How will the future look of them using the guide, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. So what YESAB told us, or what the chair of YESAB told us recently, is that they will fully use the guide in their assessment, and they of course they don't endorse it, as I mentioned earlier, for different reasons, but they will use it in the assessment, and they will publish the guide on their website and encourage licensees to use the guide and to follow the guide. So that is YESAB's answer that we've heard very recently. And although we haven't heard the response from the Yukon Water Board yet, it is my hope that the Yukon Water Board will do the same and use the guide when they review license application and when they make decisions. And we know that the board supports the development of this guide, and also we had one of their staff of the Secretariat participate in this guide. So everybody is well aware and supportive of Yukon government developing this guide with the intention of using it later.
Great, thank you.
Maybe something that I could add to, like, we talk about how YESAB is going to use the guide and how Yukon Water Board is going to use the guide. Maybe I can just talk again about how we, YG, are going to use the guide, because really, since Yukon government reviews license application and review and assess project when it goes in front of YESAB as a reviewer, we do look at how the water quality objectives have been developed in the project that is in front of us. And so when we will be doing that, and when the guide will be out, we will definitely be looking at whether or not the proponent did use the guide and did follow the guide. And if the proponent did not follow the guide, then we will be looking into the deviation and why was there deviation from the guide and what is the justifications for that. It doesn't mean that it cannot that there cannot be any deviation, but it's definitely something we would look close into. So let's talk about how the guide is going to be used and how water quality objectives are going to be developed and EQS. So it is really a step-by-step approach, and it is already happening right now. So it's not necessarily new with this guide, but right now, and what we are strongly recommended in the guide is that there is early engagement with affected First Nation and stakeholders before the project is proposed to YESAB. And then the YESAB, the project is being proposed to YESAB and is being assessed. And then it goes into a licensing stage by the Yukon Water Board. And the next slide actually goes into a little bit more details on that. So the red box here presents the pre-submission engagement. So this is where the proponent has conversation and dialogue with the various affected First Nation and stakeholders. And this is where we discussed the approach. We discussed about a few different things that Bill mentioned in his technical presentation earlier. So this is a very key step where there is conversation about the details of how we are going to come up with the water quality objective and the effluent quality standards. Then the next step is the assessment of the project by YESAB. And in this step, YESAB is going to look at how the water quality objectives have been developed. And we expect that they will be developed based on the minimum baseline data requirement, which is described in the guide, and which is 3 years of baseline data. At that stage, preliminary EQS are being derived where it's relevant. So it's preliminary EQS. Then when we get to the third stage, so this is the project licensing by the Yukon Water Board. So at that stage, we expect to see updated water quality objectives. Typically, it takes a fair bit of time for a project to go through the assessment stage by YESAB. And so during that time, there is more baseline data, which is being gathered and accumulated. So at the licensing stage, in the license application, we want to see an updated water quality objective that are based on available data at the time of the submission. And at this stage, this is where the proponent proposes EQS, and the board makes decision on the EQS, and EQS are being defined as a result of the license being issued. So I want to talk a little bit about engagement. So we really keep talking about engagement, and Bill mentioned how important that is at the different steps along the way for developing water quality objectives and developing EQS. But really, this is key. We strongly encourage the proponent to engage with stakeholders and with First Nations. Engagement is key, and it's critical for value-based and subjective steps and decision, and that includes, it's not the only ones, but it definitely includes the selection of the approach that cannot be done without engaging people, as well as the allocation of assimilative capacity. So clearly the engagement is very important.
Emily, another question. So in regards to engagement, can you describe what exactly the appropriate level of engagement with First Nations is according to the Yukon government?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a question that we hear sometimes. It's not up to Yukon government to define what is the appropriate level of engagement. This is a conversation that should be that proponent and the affected First Nation should have, and they should define what is the appropriate level of engagement, and then they actually follow that and they engage appropriately. So I cannot speak for that. I just, as a Yukon government employee, I just strongly encourage the proponent to go and define that with the affected First Nation.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'd like to pose a similar question on how folks should be, specifically the proponents, how should they be engaging with the government of Yukon on these projects?
Yeah, sure. So we do like to be engaged on water quality objective. We see that as a very important piece of a project review or project assessment, and we want to be engaged. And we want to be engaged before the project goes in front of ESAB or in front of the water board. Developing water quality objectives and defining EQS is very complex, and we want to have time to have a dialogue and conversation. So we're very open to just come and talk to us. Our email address are widely accessible and you can find them. So just come in and talk to me, or come and talk to my colleagues, come and talk to us. And also I strongly encourage people to engage with us before the review period starts, because once the public review, the seeking views and information stage or the public review start, then we have a short time, and it's not a good place to have this dialogue. We prefer to have the dialogue before it comes to these stages.
Okay, thank you.
Reporting requirements. So we want to have, so typically it is a standalone document, and this is our preference for sure. We want to see how the proponent came up with the water quality objective. What was the approach? So what the approach was and why that approach was selected. How did the COPC were identified? We want to see all the step-by-step development process well described in a standalone document. We want to have that documented and accessible, so that we can understand how those decisions came about and how those decisions were made. So really, we strongly encourage proponents to describe thoroughly how they came up with the water quality objective and the EQS. A final things that I want to mention is that I just want to talk briefly about adaptive management plans. And I'll start by saying that, as Bill actually said that already, so water quality objectives are objectives. They are not a compliance requirement. And also another thing is that the water quality in the receiving environment can be influenced by mining activities, but it can also be influenced by other conditions, so natural conditions or other activities. And we want the water quality objective to be met most of the time. And for that reason, the adaptive management plans are required of mining operators, and we require them because they help protect the water quality in the receiving environment. And the way that works is that once the water quality objectives are established, then the adaptive management plan established a framework where there is appropriate monitoring that in the receiving environment that happens. And it also provides a way for people to know if there's a change from expected conditions, and if there's something that wasn't expected or that was unexpected, then they have a process by which they can investigate and react before the water quality objectives are being exceeded. So basically, having the adaptive management plan in place help avoid significant adverse effect in the receiving environment, and they are key. So we don't really talk about it in this guide here, but this is definitely something that is needed and required of proponents.
Okay. A quick question about these adaptive management plans. So from what I understand, that the government of Yukon is working on a guideline for adaptive management plans, but this guideline is distinct from these water quality objectives. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
Emma, that is correct. So we are presenting here a video on the guide on water quality objective and EQS. And a parallel initiative that Yukon government has is developing another guide that provide some guidance on how adaptive management plans should be developed and what they should include. So that is a different initiative, and you will hear about it soon. So we did receive reviews from various First Nation and industry groups as well, and we will release that sometime in late 2020 as well. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Great, thanks, Emily. So thank you, everyone. That concludes our technical presentation on the water quality objectives and effluent standards guides. So if you have any questions about this presentation or about these guidelines, please contact either Emily Janin or myself, and we would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, if you're looking for a more introductory level presentation, please click the other presentation linked in the package, and that will give a sort of a broad overview of what these guidelines are all about. Thanks very much, and take care. So thanks everyone for tuning into the technical overview of the Yukon Guide for Developing Water Quality Objectives and Effluent Quality Standards. I hope this presentation was of use to you, and we would love to hear from you. Any questions or feedback that you may have, please get in contact with us. On the next slide, we have our Emily's contact information, so if you have any questions or considerations, please send her an email or give her a call. Additionally, we have a more overview introductory presentation that outlines similar content that was presented in this presentation. So please, if you would like to share that with other folks or just have a refresher, please access that presentation as well. Thanks very much and take care.